Hey, welcome to Chapter 15. We're going to be talking about the endocrine system today. Our learning objectives are to describe the negative feedback system that controls production of hormones. We're going to list the major endocrine glands and the hormones they produce, and we'll describe the structure and functions of the pituitary gland with the effects of these hormones that live in the pituitary gland: the growth hormone, prolactin, thyroid-stimulating hormone, adrenal corticotropic hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH, luteinizing hormone, or LH, melanocyte-stimulating hormone, antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. We're also going to describe the structure of the thyroid gland and the effects of the thyroid hormone, calcitonin, and parathormone. We'll differentiate between T3 and T4. We'll list the three categories of hormones that are produced by the adrenal cortex and the hormones that are produced by the pancreatic islet cells and describe the effects of each. We'll describe the effects of androgens, estrogens, and progestins, and list the hormones produced by the kidneys, stomach, small intestine, placenta, thymus, and pineal body. Now, it sounds like a lot of learning objectives, but believe it or not, you're going to, at the end of this lecture, be able to understand how your system talks to your entire body and creates this wonderful homeostasis that allows us to live and produce more offspring. So the endocrine system works together with the nervous system to maintain homeostasis. Its primary function is to produce hormones, and those hormones act on specific target cells to produce specific effects. When you look at the picture of this cat, you can see all the endocrine organs that we'll be talking about. We have the pituitary gland in the brain. There's also a pineal gland in the brain that's not shown here. It's very close to the pituitary gland, so it'd be difficult to differentiate between the two in this picture. We also have a thyroid gland, and on top of the thyroid gland, there is a parathyroid gland. Para means beside, and it's right there beside the thyroid gland. There's the adrenal gland, which is near the kidney, and we have the ovary that also lives near the kidney, and we have the testes that start near the kidney, but then will travel through the abdomen to the outside. And then there's the pancreas. So there's very few organs that we actually have to think about when we think about the endocrine system. There are a lot more hormones because the hormones, they work on a negative feedback system, and so you'll have one that will counteract the other in order to maintain homeostasis. Hormones are chemical messengers produced by these endocrine glands and secreted directly into blood vessels. They produce effects when they find their specific receptors in or on cells. A cell that has receptors for a particular hormone is referred to as the target of that hormone. So like I said, control of hormone secretion is based on a negative feedback system, like a thermostat in your house. When you set the thermostat to a certain temperature that is comfortable for you, the furnace will turn on and it will reach that temperature. And as soon as it reaches that temperature, the thermometer within the thermostat says to turn off the heat, the furnace. And that's a negative feedback system. So when the level of a specific hormone drops below needed levels, then the appropriate endocrine gland is stimulated to produce more hormone. So that's the furnace turning on. And once that proper hormone level is present, the certain temperature that you get in the house, in the bloodstream, that hormone level gets to a certain level, and it stimulates the endocrine gland or stimulation of that endocrine gland is reduced, and the production of that hormone is reduced. So you get to the certain temperature in the home, and the thermostat turns off the furnace. Direct stimulation of the nervous system is part of what controls the hormone secretion. Secretion of some hormones is stimulated by the sympathetic nerve impulses when an animal feels threatened. So a fight or flight response is a result of endocrine stimulation by the sympathetic nervous system. Our major endocrine glands that you saw in the picture, we have the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. Previously, when I pointed to at the picture, we just said pituitary gland, but there are actually two parts of that pituitary gland, the one in front, which is anterior, and the one in the back, which is posterior. There's the thyroid and the parathyroid, the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. They're part of the adrenal gland, the same thing, but the cortex produces different uh, hormones than the medulla does. We have the pancreas, and specifically within the pancreas, we're talking about the islets, little islets of cells, and the testes and the ovary. All right, so we're going to start with the hypothalamus, which is a part of your brain. It's part of the diencephalon section of the brain, so it's within the center between the two cerebral halves, and it controls the activities of the pituitary gland. So it's the control center for that pituitary gland. There is a portal system of blood that links the hypothalamus with the anterior portion of the pituitary gland. So this hypothalamus is part of the nervous system, releases, has a neurosecretory cell that releases hormones that goes through this portal system of blood vessels into the anterior pituitary and hits some target cells in that anterior pituitary, which causes the release of more hormone. The modified neurons in the hypothalamus will then secrete releasing and inhibiting factors, depending on what the signal is, into the portal blood vessels. And they're specific for a particular anterior pituitary hormone. These modified neurons in the hypothalamus also secrete two hormones, antidiuretic hormone, ADH, and oxytocin. Oxytocin we refer to as the love hormone because it produces a lot of the feelings and of romantic love. It also is in charge of a lot of the processes that lead to reproduction and also to the feeding of newborns. So ADH and oxytocin are produced in the hypothalamus, secreted and transported to the posterior pituitary, where they remain in storage. They're released into the bloodstream by the nerve impulses of the hypothalamus. So this is really important. I want you to remember this. ADH and oxytocin they are produced in the hypothalamus, they live in the posterior pituitary until they are released by nerve impulses from the hypothalamus. Okay, the pituitary gland is also called the hypophysis. It's actually two separate glands, and they have different structures, different functions, and different embryological origins. So they came from different cells within the embryo, which is pretty phenomenal because they found their way to each other, and they have their own separate functions, but they're located as two sacs right near each other. The anterior pituitary is also known as the adenohypophysis, is the rostral portion or closer to the nose. It's stimulated by the hypothalamus and provides or from direct feedback from the target organs, that negative feedback, and which will allow it to produce its hormone. The posterior pituitary or the neurohypophysis is the caudal portion. It stores and releases hormones produced in the hypothalamus. What are those hormones? ADH and oxytocin. Okay, I do want you to remember that. We're also going to have you remember the 7 hormones that live in the anterior pituitary. And this is what they are: growth hormone, prolactin, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, a melanocyte-stimulating hormone. So those are the 7 pituitary hormones that live in the anterior pituitary. They're produced in the anterior pituitary, and the release is caused by either the hypothalamus or the feedback system from the target organ. Growth hormone is also known as somatotropin or somatotropic hormone. It promotes body growth in young animals, and it helps to regulate the metabolism of proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids in all the body's cells. Prolactin helps trigger and maintain lactation. It causes the secretion of milk by the mammary glands. Prolactin production and release continues as long as the teat or nipple continues to be stimulated by nursing or milking. When prolactin stimulation stops, then milk production stops, and the mammary gland shrinks back to its non-lactating size. Thyroid stimulating hormone is known as thyrotrophic hormone. It stimulates growth and development of the thyroid gland and causes it to produce its own hormones. Secretion is regulated by feedback from the thyroid gland. It has direct effects on anterior pituitary gland through changes in TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone releasing factor, which is produced by the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus produces TSH releasing factor, which causes thyroid stimulating hormone to be released, which goes to the thyroid gland, which then sends feedback when it's had enough back to the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus to let it know to stop releasing TSH. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, stimulates growth and development of the adrenal cortex and release of some of its hormones. It's regulated by feedback from the hormones of the adrenal gland. ACTH can also be released quickly as a result of stimulation of the hypothalamus by other parts of the brain. The hypothalamus sends a burst of ACTH releasing factor to the anterior pituitary through the portal system, causing ACTH to be released quickly. Follicle-stimulating hormone. In the female, this stimulates growth and development of the ovarian follicles, and we've talked about this before. It causes oogenesis, or the building or the promoting of growth of the egg. It also stimulates cells lining the follicles to produce and secrete estrogens. In the male, the FSH stimulates spermatogenesis, so the making of the sperm. Luteinizing hormone, or LH, completes the process of follicle development in the ovary. It increases increasing amounts of estrogens feed back to the anterior pituitary, cause reduced production of FSH and increased production of LH. LH levels reach a peak when the follicle is fully mature, and LH levels, a surge of LH levels, will cause ovulation most of the time. Now remember, there are some species in which they must copulate in order to get release to get that LH surge and get release of the egg. That's the rabbit and the ferret and the cat. And if they don't get copulation, then they continue to produce estrogen, and the LH doesn't reach a surge where the egg is released. And so we have constant, it's a hyperestrogenism, which eventually can actually kill the animal. After ovulation, LH stimulates cells in the empty follicle to multiply and produce or develop into the corpus luteum. That corpus luteum produces progestin hormones, which are necessary for the maintenance of pregnancy. We say that progesterone protects pregnancy. In the male, LH is also used. It stimulates the interstitial cells to develop and produce testosterone. Interstitial cells help to keep the sperm healthy. So just like LH hormone in the female protects pregnancy, LH in the male helps to protect the reproductive cells. Melanocyte stimulating hormone, or MSH, is associated with the control of color changes in the pigment cells, or melanocytes, of reptiles, fish, and amphibians. Administration of artificially large amounts of MSH to higher mammals can cause darkening of the skin from melanocyte stimulation. Now we're on to the posterior pituitary. It stores which two hormones produced in the hypothalamus? That's right, it's the ADH and oxytocin. It's transported from hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary and stored in nerve endings, periodically released into the bloodstream in response to nerve impulses from the hypothalamus. Antidiuretic hormone. It helps prevent diuresis. It's anti-diuretic. What is diuresis? It's the removal of water from the body. So antidiuresis would be to retain water in the body. Receptors in the hypothalamus detect changes in osmotic pressure of the blood that result from dehydration or hemoconcentration. It generates nerve impulses, which causes the release of ADH. ADH travels to the kidney, causes the kidney to reabsorb more water from the urine and return it to the bloodstream. ADH deficiency, when we don't have enough ADH, causes a disease called diabetes insipidus, not diabetes mellitus, which is a disease of glucose regulation, but diabetes insipidus, which is a low antidiuretic hormone. Diabetes just means they're drinking a lot more water and they're urinating a lot more. And this is what we see because they're not able to retain water. They have to continually drink water in order to have what they need for their body function. Oxytocin, the love hormone, it has effects on the uterus, which causes contraction of the myometrium at the time of breeding and at parturition. It induces uterine contractions that aid transport of the spermatozoa to the oviducts, and it also stimulates uterine contractions that aid in the delivery of the fetus and the placenta. It also helps with milk letdown. So it has an effect on the active mammary glands only when mammary glands are affected and grow because of prolactin. What oxytocin does is causes movement of the milk down to the lower parts of the gland. It's called milk letdown. Stimulation of the teat or nipple by nursing or milking causes oxytocin to be released in the bloodstream. It causes contraction of the myoepithelial cells around the mammary gland alveoli and small ducts, and it forces milk into the lower parts of the gland. The other interesting thing that it does is it helps the mother to feel calm and relaxed, which is important because when she's feeding her offspring, she needs to feel calm and relaxed so she will stay in place and allow them to nurse. All right, we're on to the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland has two lobes on either side of the larynx, and these lobes may be connected by an isthmus. Now, that isthmus is a word that comes from geography, and it just means a small strait of land between two masses of land. The thyroid hormone is produced in those follicles, which are simple cuboidal glandular cells, and they're surrounding a globule of thyroid hormone precursor. These are different shapes from different species of how you might see the thyroid gland. All right, there are several thyroid hormones. There's T3, which is triiodothyronine. It has 3 iodine molecules on it. And then there's T4, which is tetraiodothyronine or thyroxine. Thyroid hormones are produced when TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, from the anterior pituitary reaches the thyroid gland. T4 is produced in greater abundance than T3, but it's mostly converted to T3 before producing effects on target cells. So T4, we see a lot of T4 within the bloodstream, but it doesn't really have, it's not as active unless it is actually converted into T3 or it loses an iodine molecule. Thyroid hormones influence the development and maturation of the central nervous system, growth and development of muscles and bones. So it's very important, especially as animals are growing. It does have a calorogenic effect. It regulates the metabolic rate of all the body's cells, and it allows the animal to generate heat and maintain a constant internal body temperature. So when we talk about animals that are hypothyroid or have less than normal thyroid levels, we can actually look at what it's supposed to do, and when we're missing it, we see the effect on the animal. So we have a decreased growth and development of muscles and bones. We have problems with the CNS. They tend to be a little bit colder than normal, and they gain a lot of weight. So production increases with exposure to cold normally, and then increases the metabolic rate to generate more heat. So when you go outside and you start to shiver, your thyroid gland is actually getting into the game here and trying to produce an increased metabolic rate so that it can warm you up. The effects of the metabolism of proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids, or it affects those the metabolism of those proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids, much like growth hormone does. So it works just like growth hormone in some ways. Calcitonin is another hormone that's produced within the thyroid. It's produced by C cells located between the thyroid follicles, and it helps to maintain blood calcium levels. It prevents hypercalcemia by encouraging excess calcium to be deposited in the bones. So when there's too much calcium in the blood, calcitonin kicks in and puts the calcium to the bones. Calcium is involved in a lot of different functions in the body. So from muscle contraction, blood clotting, milk secretion, and formation and maintenance of the skeleton. So we do need to have several methods to maintain the concentration of calcium within the body and within the blood. Parathyroid hormone, that parathyroid gland right near the thyroid, is also called parathormone, and it's produced by those parathyroid glands. These glands are small, very pale nodules in, on, or near the thyroid glands, sometimes very difficult to find. They also help to maintain blood calcium levels. They prevent hypocalcemia. So calcitonin helps to prevent hypercalcemia. Parathormone prevents hypocalcemia. So if there's too little blood or calcium in the blood, the parathormone causes the kidneys to retain calcium and the intestine to absorb calcium from food, and it will actually withdraw calcium from the bones. Onto the adrenal glands. They are located near the cranial ends of the kidneys, and they consist of actually two glands, but they look like one gland. There's the adrenal cortex, which is the outside of the adrenal gland, and the adrenal medulla, which is the inside of the adrenal gland. This is what it looks like. It produces numerous steroid hormones that are classified into three main groups: glucocorticoids, mineralocorticoids, and sex hormones. Glucocorticoids are cortisone, cortisol, corticosteroid. They have a hyperglycemic effect, so they're going to put more glucose into the bloodstream. It's one of the reasons we don't like to use steroids. These are cortisone is a steroid, prednisone is a steroid. We don't want to use steroids when we have a diabetic animal, diabetic mellitus, of course, because it will actually put more glucose into the bloodstream. Glucocorticoids also help maintain blood pressure and help the body resist the effects of stress. So they are very important. Mineralocorticoids, one example is aldosterone. They help to regulate the levels of important electrolytes or mineral salts in the body. And then there are sex hormones, which are androgens and estrogens. The adrenal medulla produces epinephrine and norepinephrine. The secretion is controlled by the sympathetic portion of the autonomic nervous system, and it's involved in the fight or flight response. What happens is you get an increased heart rate and output, increased blood pressure, dilate the air passageways in the lungs, and decrease GI function. It's important for survival, so we need it, but it is dangerous to maintain, so we don't want too much of it. The pancreas is located near the duodenum. Let me make sure here. There we go. Located near the duodenum. It has both exocrine, which is digestive enzymes, and endocrine functions. Okay, exocrine means that it puts out lipase and amylase and protease, and those digestive enzymes help to break down the nutrients that we get from our food. Endocrine component is just a small percentage of the total volume of the organ, and this endocrine component exists in the pancreatic islets, or we also call them the islets of Langerhans, which are a group of cells which are scattered throughout the pancreas. There are alpha cells which produce glucagon, there are beta cells which produce insulin, and delta cells which produce somatostatin. Now, it's important to know where these cells are located because they're in the pancreas, and if anything happens to the pancreas, not only can it damage the exocrine function, but it can also damage the endocrine function. This is why when we have an animal with pancreatitis or chronic pancreatitis, they very often turn into animals with diabetes mellitus. So let's talk about the pancreatic hormones. Insulin, you should know what insulin does. It lowers blood glucose levels by causing glucose, amino acids, and fatty acids to be absorbed into the body's cells. Glucagon also lowers blood glucose levels by stimulating the liver cells to convert glucose to glycogen or glycogen to glucose and stimulate gluconeogenesis. So it works on the liver and it works with glycogen and converting it to glucose. So it works a little bit differently from insulin. Somatostatin inhibits the secretion of insulin, glucagon, and growth hormone, and it diminishes GI activity. So somatostatin is going to be the negative feedback for insulin and glucagon. Moving on to the testes. The testes have, we talked about interstitial cells. These are clumps of endocrine cells, and they produce androgens when they are stimulated by LH. Interstitial cell stimulating hormone is what stimulates this in the male. Testosterone is the primary androgen, and it provides for development of male secondary sex characteristics and the accessory sex glands. It also activates spermatogenesis. So here we have the cells in the seminiferous tubules. We've got the spermatozoa that are growing, and in between the seminiferous tubules, which all then will join together into the epididymis and into the vas deferens, are these interstitial or Leydig cells. And this is where the androgens are produced. Ovaries produce ova and hormones in cycles. We've talked about the estrous cycle before, and we've talked about which hormones are produced when. They are controlled by follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, so FSH and LH. And then there are hormone groups that are produced within the ovaries, estrogens and progestins. And they're produced in a certain order to maintain the cycle of reproductivity, so that we know when an animal is ready to be bred. And we can actually measure these hormones to give us a better idea, and we can manipulate them as well to give us a better idea of the best time to breed an animal. Estrogens are stimulated by FSH, which is stimulating ovarian follicles. So that estrogens come from these ovarian follicles which have been stimulated by FSH. The cells of the follicles produce and release estrogens, and the amount of estrogen produced increases as the follicle grows. So the bigger the follicle is, the more estrogen is produced. It's those increasing estrogen levels that accelerate physical and behavioral changes that we see in the animal that let us know when the animal is ready to breed. The estrogens will then feed back to the anterior pituitary and cause the anterior pituitary to reduce the production of FSH, so it's turning down the furnace, and then it increases the production of LH, so it may be increasing the air conditioning. When the follicle is fully mature, LH level peaks, and in most species, that's when ovulation occurs. Remember, there are 3 species that we've discussed before that ovulation will not occur until copulation occurs. Progestins are groups of hormones produced by the corpus luteum. Remember that corpus luteum is what is left after the ovulation of the egg from the follicle. High LH level stimulates cells of the empty follicle to multiply and develop into that corpus luteum. And then progesterone is produced. It's the principal progestin. It helps to prepare the uterus to receive that fertilized ovum, which is needed to maintain pregnancy. Progesterone protects pregnancy. In the pregnant female, the hormone signal is sent from the uterus and the corpus luteum is maintained. So once that egg is fertilized and a blastocyst attaches to the wall of the uterus, it sends a signal back to the corpus luteum to stick around and produce more progesterone. If there is no pregnancy, we don't get fertilization of the egg, then we don't have a hormone signal, and then the corpus luteum will shrink and disappear, and we'll go through the cycle again. Kidneys. Kidneys produce erythropoietin, which stimulates red bone marrow to increase production of red blood cells. And the production of erythropoietin is stimulated by hypoxia. So if there's low oxygen in the blood going through the kidneys will produce erythropoietin, which will stimulate the bone marrow to produce more red blood cells. As red blood cell production increases, more oxygen then feeds back to the kidney and slows the production of erythropoietin. Within the stomach, we have gastrin. Gastrin is a hormone that is produced by cells in the wall of the stomach. The secretion of gastrin is stimulated by the presence of food in the stomach, which stimulates those gastric glands to secrete hydrochloric acid and digestive enzymes. Gastrin also encourages muscular contractions of the stomach wall. In the small intestine, secretin and cholecystokinin. These are hormones that are produced by cells in the lining of the small intestine, and secretion occurs in response to the presence of chyme in the duodenum. So what is chyme? Chyme is the juice that is produced by the stomach when it digests the food. So the food, as it digests and mixed with the hydrochloric acid, it gets liquid, and that is what we call chyme. It goes into the small intestine, and it causes the secretion of secretin and cholecystokinin. Secretin stimulates the pancreas to secrete fluid, and that neutralizes that acidic chyme. It's mixed with hydrochloric acid in the stomach, right? After it passes out of the stomach. So it produces a buffering solution. Cholecystokinin stimulates the pancreas to release digestive enzymes into the duodenum. So let's try to remember what those digestive enzymes are. Amylase breaks down fat. Protease breaks down proteins. Amylase breaks down carbohydrates. Protease breaks down proteins. And lipase breaks down fats. The placenta. The placenta surrounds a developing fetus during pregnancy. It also has hormones. It acts as that interface between the maternal circulation, and those hormones help to support and maintain pregnancy. Hormones that are produced within the placenta include estrogen and progesterone, as well as, in some species, chorionic gonadotropin. Chorionic gonadotropin is the hormone that we test for when you take a pregnancy test. The thymus. The thymus extends cranially from the level of the heart up into the neck region along both sides of the trachea. We've talked about the thymus before when we talked about the development of lymphocytes into T cells and B cells. It is large in young animals because that's when the immune system is developing, and it atrophies later in life. The function involves hormones or hormone-like chemical substances like thymosin and thymopoietin. They cause certain cells to be transformed into T lymphocytes or T cells. Now, these T cells can specialize as a suppressor, as a cytotoxic T cell, as a helper T cell, or as a regulatory T cell. The pineal body. This is really interesting. We've known about this pineal body for a very long period of time. You can see this in Egyptian hieroglyphs. It's also called the third eye, or it's located within or near the thalamus. It's also called the third eye or the eye of Horus, and it's incorporated into this hieroglyphic, this Egyptian hieroglyphic, because that's what it looks like within the brain. Here's the pineal gland here. Here's the hypothalamus. Here's our pituitary glands, our anterior and posterior pituitary gland. Here is our optic chiasma. So this is where our optic nerve comes in. And our third eye is the pineal gland back here. It's located at the caudal end of the cleft that separates the two cerebral hemispheres. It influences cyclic activities in the body. Melatonin is a hormone-like substance that seems to affect moods and wake-sleep cycles. It could also play a role in the timing of seasonal estrous cycles in some species. So you got to think back, who are the animals that have seasonal estrous cycles? Well, actually, cats and dogs do, but Horses are long day breeders, and sheep and goats are short day breeders. So those are seasonal estrous cycles, and that is controlled by the pineal gland. All right, prostaglandins. Prostaglandins are hormone-like substances derived from the unsaturated fatty acids. So unsaturated fatty acids, remember, are those fatty acids that don't have as many hydrogen bonds, so they're not as saturated. When they're not as saturated, we talked about unsaturated fatty acids are like plant oils. Okay, so we need those. Those are really important to get in our nutrition. They're produced in a variety of body tissues, in the skin, the intestines, the brain, the kidneys, the lungs, the reproductive organs, and the eyes. There are 9 main groups, and they're designated A through I, and we write them as subscript letters with Greek letters to designate subgroups. So 9 main groups, and then there are subgroups. So an example would be prostaglandin F to alpha. 2-alpha would be the subgroup. PGF2-alpha is one you'll see again and again because it is something that helps to maintain or to is a part of the lysing of the follicle. And we can use PGF2-alpha when we are trying to induce ovulation so that we can get our animals onto a regulated cycle. Prostaglandins in general influence a lot of things in the body. They influence blood pressure, blood clotting, inflammation, GI function, respiratory function, reproductive, and kidney function. Now, we talk about prostaglandins often when we're talking about inflammation, and there are some prostaglandins that if we decrease their activity, we can decrease inflammation. So that's what a lot of our non-steroidal anti-inflammatories target, are prostaglandins. Now the problem is when we target those bad prostaglandins, we sometimes also target the good prostaglandins, like the GI prostaglandins, which help to protect our intestines. And that's why some non-steroidal anti-inflammatories will cause ulcerations of the stomach. It's all because of the prostaglandins. So I want you to go back through the lecture, read your book, come to me with any questions. It's a really very interesting subject. I used to think that it was the hardest thing that I ever learned, but I tell you, the more often you go through it and understand how things are so interconnected, it becomes more and more interesting. Bring questions to me in class and we'll talk about it. Thanks for listening.